The teller's voice was so quiet that I almost lost it under the hum of the lobby air conditioning. "Don't sign anything today, sir." I looked up. Her name tag said Marisol. She was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back tight, and her hands were flat on the marble counter, like she was bracing against a wind only she could feel. She slid the signature card back toward me, without ever breaking eye contact. "Please," she whispered, her voice thin and fast with fear. "Just don't sign it. Not today." Behind me, my son Marcus was talking to the branch manager in that warm, oily voice he uses on clients. He was explaining for the third time that week that his father had been forgetting things lately, that his father got confused with paperwork, that his father needed help. I was 71 years old. I had spent 41 years examining banks for a living. I could read a balance sheet in the dark, and I had not forgotten a single thing. The branch manager came around the counter with a leather folder under his arm and a smile stretched wide across his face. He set a pen down in front of me, silver, heavy, the kind you give someone when you want the moment to feel important. "Mr. Reyes," he said, his voice smooth as poured cream, "let's get you taken care of." What none of them knew, not my son, not that manager, not even the terrified young woman who had just risked her entire career on a whisper, was that I had been recording every word for 11 days. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from, because I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. And if you believe that quiet people should never be mistaken for weak people, hit that like button and subscribe. There's also a thanks button under this video if you'd ever like to support the channel directly. No obligation, ever. To understand how I ended up standing at that counter with a silver pen in my hand and a recorder in my shirt pocket, you have to go back 9 months to the first Sunday in February. My name is Nathaniel Reyes. I am 71 years old. I live in Marbury, Ohio, in a 1,900-square-foot ranch house on Chandler Street that my wife and I paid off in 1998. For 41 years, I examined financial institutions. 12 of those years, I spent as an internal auditor at a commercial bank in Columbus. The other 29 I spent as a field examiner for the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions. My job was simple to describe and almost impossible to explain at parties. I walked into banks, and I looked at their books, and I found the places where the numbers had been taught to lie. People imagine that financial fraud is loud. It isn't. Financial fraud is patient and boring and quiet. It hides in the third decimal place. It hides in a transaction posted at 4:58 on a Friday afternoon. I got very, very good at finding it. In 2009, I found a $4.1 million hole in a savings institution in Toledo. 3 people went to federal prison. I never raised my voice once during that entire examination. My wife's name was Rosalind. We were married for 44 years, 2 months and 9 days. She taught orchestra at Marbury High School for 31 years. She could tune a room of 42 teenagers by ear, and she could tell when I'd had a hard week from the sound of my car door closing in the driveway. Rosalind died 3 years ago in November, pancreatic cancer. It took her in 7 months, and it took her so completely that by the end, I was measuring her days in the number of songs she could still hum. The last thing she said to me was not profound. She asked me if I had remembered to move the sprinkler off the hydrangeas. I told her I had. That was a lie. I had not moved the sprinkler in 3 weeks because I had not left her side in 3 weeks. She smiled at me anyway, like she knew. After she was gone, the house got so quiet that I started leaving the radio on in the kitchen just to hear a human voice at 7 in the morning. We had 1 son. Marcus Reyes, 42 years old, tall, handsome, charming in the way that opens doors and empties rooms. Marcus sold commercial real estate. He had been selling commercial real estate for 19 years, and in all that time, he had never once had a bad year, according to Marcus. The truth was different. I knew the truth because I am the kind of man who notices when a son who claims to be closing $11 million deals refinances his house twice in 4 years. His wife was Priscilla Vane Reyes. She was 39, elegant, precise, and she had a way of looking at a room that reminded me of an appraiser walking a property. Priscilla ran a company called Meridian Senior Solutions. It was, according to her website, a boutique elder care consultancy that helped families navigate the complexities of aging with dignity. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story doesn't work if I pretend I was a saint. I never liked Priscilla, not from the first dinner, not from the moment she asked me, before dessert, whether the house on Chandler Street had ever been appraised. Rosalind told me I was being unfair. Rosalind told me that people show you who they are eventually, and that until then you feed them, and you keep your opinions in your pocket. So I kept my opinions in my pocket for 11 years. And then there was Sophie, my granddaughter, 16 years old, all elbows and stubbornness, and the only human being on this earth who could still make me laugh without warning. Sophie played cello. Rosalind put her first bow in her hand when she was 6 years old, and by 14, she was better than her grandmother had ever been. Every Sunday, Sophie came to my house at 2 in the afternoon. We ate grilled cheese sandwiches. She practiced in the living room while I graded her intonation like a man who knows absolutely nothing about music and refuses to admit it. That was my life after Rosalind. A quiet house, a Sunday cello, a pension, and a portfolio I had built one boring decision at a time over 4 decades. I want to be specific about that portfolio, because it matters enormously to everything that comes after. At the time this story begins, I had $1,412,000 in investment accounts. I had $250,000 from Rosalind's life insurance, untouched, sitting in a separate certificate of deposit because I could not stand the thought of spending it. I had a house worth about $340,000, free and clear. I had a state pension paying me $4,100 a month. And I had one other asset that will matter later, a small commercial building on Delaney Street, a 2-unit retail property that Rosalind and I bought in 1991 for $62,000. By the time this story starts, that building was worth about $480,000, and it brought in $3,200 a month in rent from a bakery and an insurance agency. Total, everything together, I was worth a little over $2.4 million. Nobody knew that number. Not Marcus. Not Priscilla. Not my neighbors, who watched me drive a 2014 Buick and mow my own lawn in a 20-year-old flannel shirt. That was deliberate. Men who examine banks for a living learn very early that the loudest account is almost never the largest one. Now, the first Sunday in February, Sophie didn't come. That was the first thing that was wrong. She had never missed a Sunday. Not for a school trip, not for a boyfriend, not for the flu. When she was 13, with 102 fever, she came over and slept on my couch, listening to Dvorak. I called Marcus at 3:15. He didn't answer. I called Priscilla at 3:40. She answered on the 5th ring, and she was breathing like someone who had rehearsed. "Nathaniel," she said, her tone honeyed and slow. "The way you speak to a child at a funeral. Sophie's got a lot going on right now. We think Sundays are getting to be a lot for you." I stood in my kitchen holding 2 grilled cheese sandwiches on a plate. "A lot for me," I repeated. "You've been tired," she said, her voice soft with a concern that had no warmth in it at all. "Marcus has noticed. We both have. I had not been tired. I had walked 3 miles that morning. I had rebalanced my own portfolio on Thursday and caught a fee error in my brokerage statement that saved me $1,100. But I said, maybe you're right. I said it because 41 years of examinations had taught me one thing above everything else. When a subject volunteers an explanation you did not ask for, you do not argue. You write it down, and you wait, and you let them keep talking. Priscilla kept talking. She talked for another 6 minutes, and somewhere in minute 4, she said the sentence that turned my entire year. We just want to make sure everything's protected, she said. For Sophie's sake, long term. Protected. That is a word I have heard in 312 bank examinations. It almost never means what the person saying it wants you to think it means. I hung up the phone, and I stood in my kitchen for a long time. Then I ate both grilled cheese sandwiches, because I was raised in a house where you did not waste food, and because I needed something to do with my hands while I thought. Here is what I knew at 4 o'clock on that Sunday afternoon. I knew that my daughter-in-law had just cut off my only contact with my granddaughter. I knew she had done it under the cover of concern for my health, and I knew she had used the word protected. Here is what I did not know yet. I did not know that the paperwork had already been drafted. I did not know that it had been drafted 11 days earlier by a lawyer in Dublin, Ohio, who had never met me. I found out on the following Thursday, and I found out entirely by accident, which is how almost every real fraud gets discovered. Thursday, the 9th of February, 2:17 in the afternoon. I drove to Harborline Community Bank on Fenwick Avenue to deposit a rent check from the bakery on Delaney Street. I had banked at Harborline for 26 years, back when it was Marbury Savings, before the merger, before the marble counters, and the branded coffee station in the lobby. The teller I usually saw was a woman named Doris, who retired in December. That Thursday, I got a young man named Trevor, who had the unfocused cheerfulness of someone 6 weeks into his first job. He took my check, he typed, and then his face did a thing I have seen exactly 4 times in my career. His eyebrows went up, then flattened, then he glanced at his screen, then he glanced at me, then he glanced at his screen again. That is the face of a person reading something on a monitor that does not match the person standing in front of them. Everything all right? I asked, keeping my voice mild and slow and slightly puzzled. Oh, yes, sir. Absolutely, Trevor said, his words tumbling out too fast, his cheeks going pink, with the panic of a man who has just realized he cannot unsee something. It's just, the account has a pending update, so I'll need 1 second, sir. He got up. He walked to the manager's office at the back left corner of the branch. He closed the door. I stood at that counter, and I counted. 104 seconds. Then the manager came out, with Trevor trailing behind him, and I got my first good look at Wesley Thorne. He was 47, maybe 48, tailored charcoal suit, the kind that costs more than the man's monthly car payment ought to allow. Very white teeth, a watch worth about $9,000 on the wrist of a community bank branch manager whose salary I could estimate within $4,000. That watch was the first line item in the ledger I started keeping in my head that afternoon. Mr. Reyes, he said, extending his hand, his voice pitched at exactly the volume you use with someone you assume has hearing loss. Wesley Thorne, I'm so glad to finally meet you. Your family speaks very highly of you. My family? Which family would that be? I asked. He laughed. It was a good laugh. Warm, easy, practiced. Your son, of course. He's been in a few times. Wonderful gentleman. Very engaged with your affairs. Marcus had been in a few times. To my bank. About my accounts. I felt something cold slide down the back of my neck, and I let absolutely none of it reach my face. I have sat across the table from a chief financial officer while I told him I had found the $11 million loan he had booked to a company that did not exist. You learn to keep your face flat. Your face is the last thing you should ever spend. Ah, I said, and I let my eyes go a little unfocused, and I smiled the smile of a pleasant old man. Marcus, good boy, always looking out. He certainly is, Wesley Thorne said, his voice thick with a fellowship he had not earned. Now, we do have a small item to finalize. There's a signature card update in your file, nothing urgent. Whenever you and your son can come in together. A signature card update, I repeated slowly. Just adding an authorized party. Very routine, especially at your stage. At my stage. Well, I said, I'll wait for Marcus then. My eyes aren't what they were. That was a lie. My eyes are excellent. I had my last exam in October, and my corrected vision is 20/20 in both eyes. It was, however, the first move of the game, and I want you to understand something about that moment, because everything I did over the next 9 months lived inside it. I did not confront him. I did not demand to see the file. I did not raise my voice. An old lion on the savannah does not charge the first thing that insults him. He watches from the tall grass. He lets the herd forget he is there. He waits until the whole herd walks down to the water, and then he decides. I drove home. I made coffee. I sat down at the kitchen table, and I opened my laptop, and I logged into the online banking portal I had been using since 2011. The password did not work. I tried it 3 more times, carefully, letter by letter. On the 4th attempt, the system locked me out and displayed a message telling me to contact my branch for assistance. I sat back in my chair, and I will tell you honestly that my hands were shaking. Not from fear, from something much older and much hotter than fear. Somebody had changed the credentials on my account, and somebody at that branch had let them. I did not call the bank. Instead, I did what a bank examiner does. I went to the paper. I keep every statement, every single one, going back to 1983, in bankers' boxes in the basement, organized by year and institution. Rosalind used to say, I was the only man in Ohio with a filing system. For his filing system, I pulled the last 14 months. I spread them across the dining room table, and I did what I had done 10,000 times in my working life. I reconciled. It took me until 2:40 in the morning, and at 2:40 in the morning, on Friday the 10th of February, I found the first one, August of the previous year, a withdrawal from my money market account. $2,500, described on the statement as customer withdrawal, branch. I had not made that withdrawal. I was in Michigan that week, at a cabin on Torch Lake, with no car and no reason to withdraw $2,500 in cash. Then September, $2,500, same description. Same branch, October, 3,000, November, 3,500, December, 4,000, January, 4,000, 6 withdrawals, $19,500 total. Every single one of them under the $10,000 reporting threshold that triggers a currency transaction report. That is not carelessness. That is not a bookkeeping error. Structuring transactions to stay under a federal reporting threshold is a specific, deliberate crime, and it is done by people who know exactly where the line is. Somebody inside that branch knew exactly where the line was. I sat in my dining room at 2:40 in the morning, surrounded by 14 months of paper, in a house so quiet I could hear the refrigerator cycling in the kitchen. And for about 90 seconds, I let myself feel it. All of it. My son had been in my bank. My daughter-in-law had taken my granddaughter away from me and called it concern. $19,500 had walked out of my accounts in 6 neat, deliberate, carefully structured slices, and there was paperwork waiting with my name on it. I put my head in my hands, and I said out loud to an empty room, "Rosalind, they are robbing me." Then I stood up. I made a fresh pot of coffee at 2:50 in the morning, like a lunatic. And I got to work. Because here is the thing. They had gotten wrong, and they had gotten it so completely wrong that it would eventually cost 4 people their freedom. They had looked at a 71-year-old widower in a flannel shirt, driving a 9-year-old Buick, and they had seen a target. They had not bothered to find out what he did for a living. The first thing I did, at 3 in the morning on the 10th of February, was open a legal pad and write 4 words at the top of the page: scope, sources, timeline, exposure. That is the framework I used on every examination I ever ran. Scope means what am I actually looking at? Sources means where does verifiable information come from? Timeline means when did each event occur, to the day. Exposure means what is the total dollar amount at risk. Then I wrote a 5th word underneath, and I underlined it twice: behavior. Because there was a decision to be made, and I had to make it before the sun came up. I could confront them. I could call Marcus at 7 in the morning and tell him I knew, and I could feel absolutely magnificent for about 4 minutes. And then every document would disappear, every withdrawal slip, every internal note. Wesley Thorne would rebuild the file in a week, and my son would cry, and my daughter-in-law would tell everyone that poor Nathaniel was getting paranoid, and I would have handed them the exact narrative they needed. Or I could do the other thing. I could become the man they already believed I was. I want to be very clear about how ugly that decision felt. I am not a performer. I have never been comfortable being underestimated. My whole professional identity was built on being the most precise man in the room, and I was about to spend 9 months making people believe I could not follow a conversation. I thought about Rosalind. I thought about a documentary she loved, one we watched maybe 11 times over the years, about lions on the Serengeti. There was one shot in it she always made me rewind. An old male, scarred across the muzzle, lying in yellow grass, while a herd of buffalo moved past 40 yards away. He didn't move. He didn't even lift his head. 2 younger animals walked so close, they almost stepped on his tail. Rosalind used to say the same thing every time. She'd say, "Look at him, Nate. Everybody in that field thinks he's finished." I picked up my pen and I wrote one more line on the legal pad: "Be finished, until you're not." Then I went and slept for 4 hours. And when I woke up, I started the longest performance of my life. Step 1 was equipment, and step 1 is where most amateurs destroy their own case. Ohio is a one-party consent state. That means I can lawfully record any conversation I am a participant in, without telling the other person. I knew this cold, because half my career involved evidence chains, and I had testified in state court 11 times. But knowing you may record, and recording usefully, are 2 entirely different skills. So I did not buy a spy pen off the internet. Those things produce garbage audio that gets excluded, and half of them fail to timestamp. I drove 40 minutes to a professional audio supply store in Westerville, and I spent $940 in cash on 2 digital field recorders with automatic date and time stamping and a battery life of 31 hours. I bought a 3rd one, smaller, for $610. That one clipped inside a shirt pocket and looked like a hearing aid case. Then I did something that turned out to matter more than any of the hardware. I bought a fireproof document safe, and I established what I called a chain of custody log, a spiral notebook. Every file I created, I logged. Date, time, device, duration, where it was copied, who touched it. Nobody was ever going to stand in a courtroom and say Nathaniel Reyes cooked his evidence in a basement. Step 2 was a lawyer, and this is where I got very lucky. Her name was Elena Cruz. Elder law, 44 years old, an office above a dry cleaner on Whitmore Street, with a waiting room that had 4 chairs and a plastic fern. I had been given her name 3 years earlier by a man in my grief group whose sister had been cleaned out by a home health aide. I called her on Monday the 13th. I told her I needed 90 minutes and that I would pay for a full consultation whether or not she took the case. She gave me the 90 minutes. I laid out 14 months of statements on her conference table in chronological order, with the 6 structured withdrawals flagged in yellow. She looked at them for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mr. Reyes," she said, her voice careful and low, the way a doctor speaks when the scan came back worse than expected. "How long did you say you examined banks?" 29 years for the state, 12 before that, in internal audit. She sat back in her chair. "Then you already know what this is." "I know what the withdrawals are," I said. "Structuring. Under the CTR threshold, 6 months running, same branch. What I don't know is why they need my signature on a card if they're already getting cash out." Elena Cruz tapped the table twice with one finger. "Because cash is a trickle," she said. "The signature card is the faucet." Then she explained the architecture of it to me, and I want to explain it to you the same way she explained it to me, because if you take nothing else from this story, take this. There are 3 doors into an older person's money. The first door is joint ownership. If they add a child to your account as a joint owner with right of survivorship, that child now legally owns the money in that account. They can take all of it, today, and it is not technically theft because their name is on it. The second door is power of attorney. A durable power of attorney lets someone act in your name on everything: accounts, property, contracts. If it is drafted broadly and signed under pressure, it is a blank check with a lifetime term. The third door is the big one: guardianship. If they can get a court to declare you incapacitated, Elena said, her voice going flat and hard, they don't need your signature at all, ever again. They get control of your assets, your housing, your medical care, and your visitors. And the standard of proof in probate court is a lot lower than people think. Your visitors. I sat in that little office above a dry cleaner, and I understood something I had missed for 8 days. Sophie. They had already tested door number 3. Cutting off my granddaughter's Sunday visits was not cruelty for its own sake. It was preparation. Because when they eventually stood in front of a probate judge and said, "This man is isolated, this man has no support system, this man sees no one," they needed that to be true. And they needed it to have been true for a while. They had started building the record before I even knew there was a case. "Elena," I said, "how long have they been at this?" "Longer than you think," she said. "It always is." She was right. It was so much longer than I thought that when I eventually found out, I had to sit down on my own basement stairs. But that came in June. In February, I had a job to do. We built the plan in that office over the next 2 hours, and it had 4 objectives. 1. Do not stop the theft. Let it continue and document every instance. Every additional withdrawal was another count. That one nearly broke me. Elena watched my face while she said it. "They will take more of your money, Mr. Reyes. Possibly a great deal more. I need you to decide right now whether you can live with that." I thought about it for exactly 11 seconds. How much more? I don't know. 50,000, 100. It depends how greedy they get. And if I stop it today? Then you get back $19,500. They get a warning, and they do it to the next person, with a nicer setup. Then let them take it, I said. Objective 2. Preserve the paper. Every original document into the fireproof safe. Copies to Elena's office. A third set to a safe deposit box at a completely different institution, 40 minutes away, in Delaware, Ohio, opened under a signature card only I had ever touched. Objective 3. Capture them explaining it. Not hints, not sideways remarks. Their own voices, describing their own scheme, in plain language, on a time-stamped file. Objective 4. And this was the one that took 9 months. Become harmless. They have a theory about you, Elena said. That theory is the entire foundation of their case. Do not fight the theory. Feed it. So I fed it. It started small, because it had to. You cannot go from sharp to soft in a week without it looking staged. That Thursday, I called Marcus and asked him what day the trash went out. I had lived on Chandler Street for 38 years. Trash goes out Tuesday night. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, very gently, "It's Tuesday, Dad, same as always." "Tuesday," I said. "All right, thank you, son." I hung up, and I wrote in my log, 16 Feb, 4:42 p.m., first deliberate error, subject response, gentle correction, no suspicion. The next week I called him twice about the same doctor's appointment. The week after, I let a bill go past due, a $9.40 water bill I paid in full the following month, but not before the notice arrived where Priscilla could see it on my counter. Because Priscilla had started coming by. That was the tell that told me everything was working. In 11 years, that woman had crossed my threshold maybe 14 times. Starting the last week of February, she came every Wednesday at 11 in the morning with a paper bag of groceries I had not asked for. And she walked my house. Not obviously. She would set the groceries on the counter and then drift. Down the hall, past the office. A pause at the doorway of the bedroom I had shared with my wife for 38 years. The first time she did it, I stood at the sink with my back to her and my hands in warm dishwater, and I let her. The second time, I ran the recorder. By the 4th week, I had begun to understand exactly what she was cataloging. She was not looking for money. She was looking for evidence of decline. So I gave her some. I want to walk you through this part carefully, because people hear the phrase, "He pretended to be confused," and they picture a man drooling in a chair. That is not how it works. That is not even close to how it works. A performance like that has to be built out of small, boring, verifiable details. Because the audience is not stupid. Priscilla Vane Reyes was many things, and stupid was not on the list. So I built the set first. On a Tuesday in early March, I bought a package of sticky notes, bright yellow, 300 sheets, and I wrote reminders and stuck them everywhere. A reasonable person would never need one. Stove, check before bed, on the range hood. Lock back door, on the back door. Take blue pill with breakfast, on the coffee maker. Then, on the inside of the front door, at eye level, in slightly shaky handwriting I had practiced for 40 minutes. Did you turn off the water? That last one was the masterstroke, and I knew it the moment I stuck it up, because it was a question. It implied a man who had already flooded something once. I put 12 notes up in total. Not 40. 40 is theater. 12 is a man quietly losing ground. Then I changed my clothes. Not dramatically. I simply stopped ironing. For 38 years I ironed my shirts on Sunday evenings, while listening to the radio, because Rosalind liked the smell of hot cotton in the house. I stopped, and I let one collar go slightly frayed. And I wore the same green cardigan 4 Wednesdays in a row. And I stopped shaving on Wednesdays. Priscilla noticed on the 2nd Wednesday. I watched her eyes go to my jaw, and then away, fast, the way you look at something you are pleased about and do not want to be caught being pleased about. Then came the hardest part, and I will be honest with you. This is the part that cost me something I never entirely got back. I began to fail in conversation. Not gibberish, nothing so crude. I would simply lose the thread. One beat too long, one question repeated. One name reached for and not found. Now who was it that called about the gutters? I'd ask, the fella, with the truck. Dad, that was Ray. Ray Kowalczyk. He's done your gutters for 15 years. Ray, I'd say. Ray, of course. Marcus started looking at me differently in March. And here is the thing I did not expect. The thing that put a stone in my chest that never fully dissolved. He looked sad. My son looked genuinely, visibly sad, watching his father forget the name of the gutter man. There was real grief in it. And then, 30 seconds later, he would take out his phone and type something. Both things were true at the same time. He loved me, and he was building a file on me. I have thought about that contradiction for 2 years now, and I still do not have the bottom of it. On the 8th of March, Priscilla brought her laptop. She sat at my kitchen table with a mug of tea she did not drink, and she said, in that low, warm voice she used like an anesthetic, "Nathaniel, would you humor me with something? It's just a little questionnaire. Everybody at my agency does them." The recorder was in my shirt pocket. It had been running since 9:40 that morning. "All right," I said. She asked me the date. I got the month right, and the day wrong by 2. She asked me to name the current president. I got that right, because getting that wrong is a red flag so large it invites a second opinion, and a second opinion was the last thing I wanted. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I made it to 79, and then I stalled. 93, 86, 79, and then I sat there and let the silence run for 9 full seconds while she watched me over the top of her laptop. 72, I said finally. The correct answer is 72, but I had already taken 9 seconds and 1 visible false start, and she had already typed something. Then she said, "Can you remember these 3 words for me? Apple, church, table." 3 minutes later, she asked me to repeat them. "Apple," I said, and then I stopped, and I looked at the ceiling, and I said, "Church," and "Table? Was it table?" "That's right," she said, warm as a heating pad. "That's very good." That night, I transferred the file to the safe, and I wrote in my log, 8 Mar, subject administered informal cognitive screen, without consent, without credentials, without disclosure, recorded, 41 min. I did not know yet what she was going to do with those answers. I found out in April, and when I did, it stopped being a family problem and started being a federal one. But before April, there was Marisol. On the 24th of March, I went into the Harbor Line branch on Fenwick to deposit the bakery rent check, and there was a new face at window 2. Her name tag said M. Vega. She was 34, maybe 35, and she had the posture of someone who counts every minute of her shift, because every minute is $1, and every dollar is spoken for. I had chosen my routine deliberately by then. Same day of the month, same window if possible, same slow, pleasant, slightly foggy old man. I always brought the check in an envelope. I always fumbled the envelope. Once, in early April, I dropped it, and she came around the counter to pick it up for me. That is how it started, not with a plan, with a dropped envelope. "Thank you, sweetheart," I said. "You're welcome, Mr. Reyes." She knew my name without looking at the check. That registered with me. Tellers at a busy branch do not memorize the names of once-a-month depositors, unless the name has been discussed. Over the next 6 weeks, I learned 3 things about Marisol Vega, one small piece at a time, in 30-second increments at a teller window. She had been at Harbor Line for 6 years. She had a son named Diego who was 9, and she was studying for her associate's degree at night, 2 classes a semester, because that was all she could afford. And in the second week of May, I learned the 4th thing. She was afraid of her branch manager. I learned it because of a sound. I was at her window, and Wesley Thorne came out of his office behind her, and I watched her shoulders come up about a ½ inch and stay there until he had passed. That is not the reaction of an employee who finds her boss annoying. I have seen that ½ inch before. It is the body of a person who has already been made an example of once. So on the 26th of May, I did something that I want to be honest about, because it was calculated, and it involved a woman who had a 9-year-old son and a job she could not afford to lose. I made a mistake, on purpose, in front of her. I filled out a deposit slip with the wrong account number, not random digits. I used the number of my old money market account, the one the withdrawals had come out of. She caught it immediately. Of course she did. "Mr. Reyes," she said quietly, "this one goes to the checking. Do you want me to fix it?" "Did I do it wrong again?" I asked, and I let a little tremor into it. "I've been doing that. My son says I've been doing that." And Marisol Vega went very, very still. Then she said something that she absolutely should not have said, in a voice that barely made it across 18 inches of marble. "Mr. Reyes, has anybody asked you to sign anything?" I looked up at her, and for the first time in 14 weeks, I let my face be exactly what it was, just for a second, just long enough for her to see it. Her eyes widened a fraction of an inch. Then I said, in the foggy, pleasant voice, "Not yet, honey. Not yet." And she said, "Okay." And she stamped my deposit slip, and she slid it back to me, with her hand flat on top of it, and underneath her hand was a second slip of paper, blank, with 7 digits written on it, in ballpoint pen. I put it in my coat pocket. I walked out. I drove 3 blocks and parked in the lot of a hardware store, and I sat there with my hands on the wheel for a full minute. Then I called Elena Cruz, and I said, "I think somebody inside the bank wants to talk." "Don't call that number," she said immediately, her voice sharp with alarm. "Not from your phone, not from your house, and not yet." "Why not?" "Because if she's a witness, and you contact her privately before there's a case, opposing counsel will spend 3 days painting you as the man who coached her. Mr. Reyes, I need you to hear me. You are building something that has to survive cross-examination." So I did not call. Not for 6 weeks. That slip of paper sat in the fireproof safe in an envelope, logged, dated, untouched. It turned out to be the single most important piece of paper in the entire case. Because Marisol Vega was not just afraid of Wesley Thorne. She had been keeping her own records for 2.5 years. The withdrawals got bigger in April, exactly as Elena had warned me they would. On the 4th of April, $6,000. On the 19th, $6,000. On the 28th, $7,500. In May, they stopped bothering with cash entirely and started moving money electronically. $11,000 on the 2nd of May, wired to an account at a bank in Grandview Heights. $9,400 on the 16th, $14,000 on the 30th. The receiving account was titled Meridian Senior Solutions, LLC. My daughter-in-law's company was billing my accounts directly, and every wire carried a memo line, and the memo lines were the most infuriating documents I have ever read in my life. Care Coordination, monthly. IN Home Assessment and Family Liaison. Cognitive Support Services, Q2. She was charging me $11,000 a month for the privilege of driving to my house on Wednesdays with a bag of groceries and asking me to count backward from 100. By the end of May, the running total had reached $104,900. Every night, I entered the new figure in my ledger. Every night, I sat with the fact that I was watching it happen and choosing not to stop it. I lost 11 pounds between February and June. I want to be honest about that too. The performance was not free. Some of the frailty they were documenting was real. And it was real because performing frailty for 4 months hollows something out in you. There were nights I sat in the dark in Rosalind's chair and asked her out loud whether I was doing this right. She never answered, obviously. But I kept asking, because the asking helped. Then came the 11th of April, and Dr. Alan Pierce. Priscilla presented it as a favor. She called on a Tuesday and said, with tremendous casual warmth, that she had gotten me in with a wonderful physician who did comprehensive senior wellness reviews, and that she had already handled the paperwork. Already handled the paperwork, I repeated. You're a busy man, she said, and she laughed like she had made a joke. The office was in a medical park in Dublin, 41 minutes from my house. Suite 220. The sign on the door said A. Pierce, M.D., Geriatric Psychiatry and Capacity Evaluation. Capacity Evaluation. It was on the door. They did not even bother to hide it, because they were certain I could not read it in any way that mattered. I sat in that waiting room for 22 minutes, with both recorders running, one in my shirt pocket and one in the outer pocket of my coat, as a redundancy. Dr. Alan Pierce was in his 50s, soft-spoken, with reading glasses he pushed up onto his forehead and never used. He asked me 11 questions. The entire appointment lasted 19 minutes, and I know that with precision, because I have the time-stamped file. 19 minutes. To evaluate the cognitive capacity of a man with a $2.4 million estate, I gave him a performance calibrated exactly 1 notch below what I had given Priscilla, because I knew what he was there to write. And then, at minute 14, he did something so careless that I nearly lost my composure. He said, "And your daughter-in-law manages your finances, is that right?" I said, "She helps." And he said, "And I have played this file for a federal prosecutor, so I am quoting it exactly. Good. That's what we like to see. Makes everything cleaner. Makes everything cleaner." There is no clinical meaning to that sentence. There is no version of a legitimate capacity evaluation in which that sentence belongs. He was not assessing me. He was confirming that the paperwork downstream would not encounter friction. 2 weeks later, Priscilla left a copy of his report on my kitchen counter, face up, on purpose, so I would see it and feel afraid. 4 pages. Under impression, it said, moderate cognitive impairment, likely progressive. Patient demonstrates impaired executive function and is not able to independently manage complex financial affairs. Recommend supervised decision-making with immediate family involvement. I photographed all 4 pages. I logged it, and then I sat down at the kitchen table and I read that last line 11 times. Recommend supervised decision-making. That was door number 3. That was the guardianship door. And Dr. Alan Pierce had just built the frame for it in 19 minutes, for a fee I later learned was $4,200, paid by Meridian Senior Solutions. I called Elena that afternoon and read her the impression paragraph. There was a long silence on the line. "Mr. Reyes," she said at last, her voice quiet and grim, "they're going to file, probably within 6 months. I need you to prepare for the possibility that you will have to sit in a courtroom and listen to your son testify that you cannot take care of yourself. I understand." "No," she said. "You think you do. It's different when it's happening." She was right about that. It was so much worse than I imagined. But her warning gave me the thing I needed most, which was a deadline. If they were going to file, then everything I had to gather before the petition landed. Because the day that petition was filed, my accounts would be frozen. My movements would be scrutinized, and any evidence I collected afterward would be attacked as the product of an incompetent man. So in May, I made one phone call I had been avoiding for 3 months. I called Frank Delgado. Frank and I ran examinations together for 9 years at the division. He is 68 now, retired from the state, and working part-time as a consultant for the Office of Inspector General at a federal banking agency. Frank Delgado is 5'6", weighs about 140 pounds, and is, without any exaggeration, the most dangerous man I have ever met with a spreadsheet. I drove to his house in Powell on the 19th of May. I brought 2 banker's boxes. He listened to me for 50 minutes without interrupting once. Then he got up, refilled my coffee, sat back down, and said 4 words. "This isn't about you. Frank, Nate, listen to me." He tapped the top of the box. 6 structured cash withdrawals inside the CTR threshold. Executed at the branch. Over 6 consecutive months. Do you know what has to be true for that to happen? Somebody at the branch has to process them. Somebody at the branch has to process them, and nobody flags it. 6 times. He held up one finger. You worked BSA compliance for how long? Long enough. Then you know a branch that clean about structuring for one customer is not being careless. It's being managed. He tapped the box again. Somebody there knows the rules well enough to break them at the right height. That is a professional. And professionals don't have one victim, Nate. They have a book of business. I sat in Frank Delgado's kitchen in Powell, Ohio, and the floor moved under me. How many? I asked. I don't know. But if I'm right, you're not the case. You're the sample. That reframed everything. Up to that point, this had been my family stealing from me. Painful, but small. A closed circle. Frank had just described something with a shape I recognized professionally, and its shape was much, much larger. What do you need to prove it? I asked. 3 things, he said. 1. The internal referral trail, how customers get selected. 2. The money path, where the kickback goes and what it's disguised as. 3. A second victim who will talk. And how do I get any of that from outside the bank? Frank Delgado looked at me over the rim of his coffee mug. You don't, he said. You get it from inside. So on the 6th of July, with Elena Cruz's written approval and a documented protocol we followed to the letter, I finally called the 7 digits on the slip of paper that had been sitting in my safe since the 26th of May. Marisol Vega answered on the 2nd ring. I said, "This is Nathaniel Reyes. I'm sorry it took so long." And she started to cry. Not loudly. It was the exhausted kind of crying that people do when something they have been carrying alone for a very long time suddenly has a second set of hands under it. "I thought you weren't going to call," she said, her voice cracked and small. "I had to do it correctly," I told her. "For your sake more than mine." We met 3 days later, on the 9th of July, at a Bob Evans off Route 42, 31 miles from Marbury. Elena Cruz sat in the booth with us. Marisol brought a manila envelope and a handwritten list. And what that 34-year-old bank teller had done, entirely on her own, with no training, no lawyer, and no protection, was one of the bravest things I have ever seen a human being do. Marisol Vega put the manila envelope on the table between the coffee cups and did not immediately let go of it. "If I give you this," she said, her voice steady but her hands not, "I lose my job. Probably today. Maybe I get charged with something. I have a son." Elena Cruz answered her before I could. "Ms. Vega, I'm going to tell you the truth, and some of it is unpleasant. You may lose your job. But there are federal and state whistleblower protections that apply here, and I will represent you on that for free, starting the second you slide that envelope across the table. Also, I want you to understand something." Elena leaned forward. You are not the risk in this scenario. You are the reason there's a case. Marisol let go of the envelope. Inside it were 41 pages. The first 11 were photocopies of withdrawal slips. My withdrawal slips. All 6 of the structured cash transactions, and 3 more I had not yet identified because they had been posted against the certificate of deposit. Every single one of them had been processed under a teller override code, and every single override had been authorized by the same employee number. That's Mr. Thorne, Marisol said quietly. That's his code. The next 14 pages were where my stomach dropped out. It was a list, handwritten on lined notebook paper, in 3 different colors of ink, which told me it had been built over a long period of time. 14 names, each one with an age, each one with a date the account was flagged, and each one with a note in the margin. Harold Denning, 84, flagged 319, DTR-in-law, POA. 310K gone by Septim Ruth Abernathy, 79, flagged 1120, nephew joint owner, closed Act 2, 221, Constance Mbeki, 81, flagged 621, guardianship, moved to Sunrise Ridge, Walter Ashford, 88, flagged 122, no family, Meridian invoices $9,800, Mo, and down the page, 14 deep, the last entry, in fresh blue ink. Nathaniel Reyes, 71, flagged 822, son plus POA pending. Estate SD, 2 million plus. Somebody had estimated my net worth to within a reasonable margin, written it on an internal note, and put me in a queue. How did you get this? Elena asked. I didn't get it, Marisol said. I made it. Over 2.5 years. Every time I saw it happen, I wrote it down that night in my car. She explained the mechanism, and it was so simple and so cynical that it made me put my fork down. Harborline Community Bank, like a lot of small institutions, had a customer relationship management system. Tellers were encouraged to add notes to accounts, birthdays, preferences, the human touches that make a community bank feel like one. Wesley Thorne had turned that field into a targeting system. He looked for a specific profile, age 75 and up, or younger if recently widowed, high balances relative to visible lifestyle, low digital engagement, people who came into the branch instead of using the app, and, critically, one relative who had started appearing at the counter. When he found one, he tagged the account internally with a code. Marisol had seen it dozens of times. It was entered in the notes field as priority relationship review. And then a referral goes out, she said, to the consultant. What consultant? I asked, though I already knew. Marisol looked at me with something like apology. Meridian, she said. Meridian Senior Solutions. Mr. Thorne says they're our preferred family services partner. He's got their brochures at the front desk. The last 16 pages in the envelope were emails. Marisol had access to a shared branch mailbox that received scanned documents. Over 2 years, she had forwarded to her personal account every email that made her uneasy, and then printed them at a public library so there'd be no trail on her home machine. One of them, dated the 18th of August of the previous year, was from Wesley Thorne to an address at meridiansenior.com. It said, "New one for you. 71M, widower, retired state employee, no digital activity, son actively engaged and motivated. Estate looks north of 2, recommend standard onboarding. Usual arrangement. Usual arrangement." The 18th of August. That was 6 days before the first structured withdrawal, and it was 11 days before my son Marcus called me for the first time in 2 months to ask, very casually, whether I had ever gotten around to updating my estate planning. I sat in that vinyl booth off Route 42 with a plate of eggs going cold in front of me, and I did the arithmetic that everybody in a story like this eventually has to do. Marcus had not been recruited by his wife. Marcus had been recruited by a bank. Or, more precisely, a bank manager had identified a target, and my daughter-in-law's company had gone and found the family member most likely to say yes. And my son had said yes. Mr. Reyes, Marisol's voice pulled me back. There's one more thing, and I don't know if it means anything. She reached into her purse and took out a folded piece of paper. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Thorne asked me to pull the archive file on a property loan. From 3 years ago. He wanted the original signature pages scanned and sent to him directly, not through the imaging system. Whose loan? She unfolded the paper and turned it around. It was a copy of a scanned document header. Home equity line of credit. Collateral. 1120 Delaney Street, Marbury, Ohio. That was my building. The 2-unit retail property, with the bakery and the insurance agency. The one Rosalind and I bought in 1991 for $62,000. The loan amount was $217,000. The origination date was the 14th of September, 3 years earlier. Rosalind died on the 2nd of November that year. On the 14th of September, she was in hospice care at our house, 8 weeks from the end, on a fentanyl patch, sleeping 19 hours a day. And there were 2 signatures on that page, mine and hers. I had never signed that document. I had never borrowed against that building in my life. I had owned it for 31 years, free of any encumbrance, and I could have told you its tax parcel number from memory. I stared at my dead wife's signature on a loan I had never taken, dated 7 weeks before she died. I did not say anything for a while. Elena put her hand on my arm. Mr. Reyes, that's not her handwriting, I said. My voice did not sound like my voice. The R is wrong. She looped the R. That R is closed. I got up, and I walked out of the restaurant, and I stood in the parking lot next to a dumpster in 91-degree heat, with my hands on my knees, and for the first time since the night I found the structured withdrawals, I could not keep my face flat. Elena came out 4 minutes later. She stood next to me, and she did not say anything at all, which was the correct thing to do. Eventually, I straightened up. They took money out of Rosalind's building, I said, while she was dying in the front room. We don't know that yet. Elena, I looked at her. I know that. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, then we're going to prove it. Properly. And we are going to make it the last thing anyone in that courtroom hears. That was the 9th of July. I did not know it standing in that parking lot, but I had just found the thing that would eventually turn my son against his own wife, because Marcus, whatever else he had become, had adored his mother. And Marcus had not known about the loan. The confession came on the 22nd of July, and it happened for the oldest reason in the world. They had stopped seeing me. I had spent 5 months teaching 3 intelligent adults that I was furniture, and people talk in front of furniture. It was a Saturday. Marcus called at 9 in the morning and said he and Priscilla were coming by around 1, and that a gentleman from the bank would be joining them, and that it was nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about. That phrase is the smoke alarm of the English language. I hung up, and I did 4 things in the next 90 minutes. I placed the primary recorder in my shirt pocket and started it at 11:40. I placed the second recorder inside a hollowed-out hardcover book on the shelf beside the kitchen doorway and started it at 11:42. I logged both in the notebook. Then I texted Elena Cruz a single line, which she had asked me to do every time. Meeting today 1 p.m. Home, 3 subjects. Recording. Then I went and put on the green cardigan and did not shave. They arrived at 1:06. Marcus first, in a golf shirt, carrying a leather folder. Priscilla behind him in white linen, already scanning the counters. and Wesley Thorne, in a charcoal suit on a Saturday, in a private home, with a briefcase. "Mr. Reyes," he boomed, his voice bright with the aggressive good cheer of a man who thinks volume is a substitute for consent. "Wonderful to see you again. What a lovely home." "Do I know you?" I asked. There was a pause of about a second and a half, and in that second and a half, I watched all three of them relax, because I had just handed them the exact thing they wanted. "That's Wesley, Dad," Marcus said gently. "From the bank. We talked about this." "The bank," I said. "All right." We sat at the kitchen table. My kitchen table, which Rosalind and I bought at an estate sale in 1984, with the burn mark near the corner from a casserole dish in 96. Wesley Thorne opened the briefcase and took out a document about 3/8 of an inch thick. "Now, Mr. Reyes, this is just a housekeeping item," he said. "This is a durable power of attorney, and this back section here is the account authorization update, adding Marcus as a joint owner on the primary accounts. Very standard for families in your situation." "Families in my situation," I repeated slowly. "Exactly right. Where do I put my name?" Priscilla made a small sound. If you have ever heard a person try to swallow a laugh of pure relief, you know exactly what that sound is. Marcus slid a pen toward me, and I picked it up, and I held it over the signature line, and I let my hand hover there, shaking very slightly, for about 4 seconds. Then I said, "I'd like to read it first." The temperature in the room changed instantly. "Dad, I always read things," I said, with a slight petulance, the tone of an old man clinging to a habit. "Rosalind used to say, I read the back of cereal boxes." "Of course," Wesley Thorne said, but his jaw had gone tight. "Take your time." So I read it, slowly, out loud, mumbling, tracking with my finger. I read about 11 lines in 4 minutes, and I mispronounced 2 words on purpose. And I want you to understand what I was actually doing during those 4 minutes. I was letting them get bored. Because a person who is watching you is a person who is behaving. A person who has decided you are no longer a factor is a person who starts talking to the other people in the room. At minute 5, Priscilla got up and went to the counter and started making tea in my kitchen without asking. At minute 7, Wesley Thorne checked his watch. At minute 9, Marcus said, quietly, to no one in particular, "This is going to take forever." And at minute 11, with me sitting 3 feet away, finger on the page, lips moving, they started talking about me in the third person. I am going to give you this next part, as close to verbatim as I can, because I have listened to that file more times than is healthy, and because a federal grand jury heard every word of it 14 months later. Priscilla, from the counter, with the kettle going, "Wesley, walk me through the timing again. If he signs today, when can we move?" Thorne. Signature card posts Monday. Once Marcus is joint on the money market and the CD, that's about 1.6. That's immediate. The POA covers the brokerage, but the brokerage will want their own form, so figure 3 weeks. Priscilla. And the building? Thorne. The building's already leveraged. You know that. A pause. I did not look up. I kept my finger moving on the page. Priscilla. Lower. Does he know that? Thorne. Does he look like he knows that? And then my son laughed. It was a short laugh. Nervous, not cruel. But he laughed. And I have carried that particular sound in my chest ever since. Marcus. Can we not do this here? Priscilla. He's reading a power of attorney, Marcus. He can't even find the signature line. Marcus. Still. Thorne briskly, moving on. Here's the thing you need to understand about the timeline. The Pierce report is good for about 9 months before a judge starts asking why nobody acted on it. So if you're going to file the petition, File it in the fall. October, November at the latest. Priscilla. And if he signs today, do we still need the petition? Thorn. You always still need the petition. Priscilla. Why? And Wesley Thorn explained it to my daughter-in-law in my kitchen, in a clear, patient, professional voice, at a volume that a person with normal hearing, 3 feet away, could not possibly miss. Thorn. Because a signature can be revoked. A POA can be revoked. Anytime he wants. Right up until a court says he can't. Guardianship is the only instrument that's permanent. Once the court appoints Marcus, the accounts stop being his. There's no revoking. There's no complaining to the branch. There's no lawyer he can hire, because he can't retain counsel without the guardian's approval. That's the whole point. Priscilla. And the Meridian invoicing continues? Thorn. The invoicing gets easier. Guardians file an annual accounting. As long as the services are documented, nobody at the probate court reads them. I've been through this 11 times. 11 times. He said it in my kitchen, with a cup of my wife's tea going cold beside his elbow. And then Priscilla asked the question that finished them. Priscilla, what's your number on this one? Thorn. Same as always. 15 off the top, quarterly, through the consulting line. And Priscilla, the invoices need to stop saying cognitive. Say care coordination or family liaison. Cognitive gets flagged by the examiners. Cognitive gets flagged by the examiners. He was explaining to her how to structure invoices so that the state banking examiners would not notice them. To me, 3 feet away, a man who had been one of those examiners for 29 years. There is a specific feeling that comes at the end of an examination, when the last number falls into place and the picture is complete. It is not triumph. It is a very cold, very quiet click. I felt that click at the kitchen table at 1:31 in the afternoon, on the 22nd of July. And then I set the pen down. I can't sign this today, I said. Priscilla turned around fast. Why not? My glasses, I said. These are my old ones. The words are swimming. I patted my chest pocket, where the recorder was. I'll find the right ones, and we'll do it next week. Marcus said, Dad, we can just... Next week, I said, with a small, stubborn smile. I'm tired, son. And here is what you have to understand about the psychology of people running a long con on someone they consider harmless. They didn't push. They couldn't afford to push, because pushing would have been out of character for the concerned family they were performing as. The performance ran in both directions. That is the crack in every scheme like this. So they packed up. Thorn shook my hand with both of his, which is what men do when they want you to feel handled. Priscilla kissed my cheek. Marcus lingered a second in the doorway. Dad, he said, and his voice was different, lower, and for a moment almost young. You know I'm just trying to help, right? I looked at my son, and I said, I know you think you are. He blinked. It didn't land. Not that day. The door closed at 1:51. I sat perfectly still for another 2 minutes. Then I stopped both recorders, and I wrote in the log. And then I went and stood over the kitchen sink, and I was sick. That evening, I drove the files to Elena Cruz's office, and she listened to the whole thing straight through, with her elbows on the desk and her hands over her mouth. When it ended, she said one word, 11. I heard it. Mr. Reyes, that's not a family dispute anymore. That's a pattern of racketeering against elderly customers of a federally insured institution. She took off her glasses. We're past me. I have to call the FBI. The FBI agent's name was Della Whitcomb. Columbus Field Office, Financial Crime Squad, 19 years in. She was 51 years old, built like a woman who still played competitive volleyball on weekends, and she had a way of listening that made you slow down and get your facts right. We met on the 3rd of August in a conference room at Elena's office, because Elena did not want me walking into a federal building where I might be photographed. Agent Whitcomb listened to 22 minutes of the kitchen recording. Then she stopped it, and she sat back, and she said, "Mr. Reyes, who else has heard this?" "My attorney. And now you. Not your son. No. Good." She made a note. "Keep it that way. I want to be very direct with you about what happens next, because most people in your position expect this to move fast, and it does not." Then she told me the timeline, and it nearly broke me. 8 to 14 months, subpoenas to the bank, forensic accounting on Meridian's accounts, interviews with every one of the 14 names on Marisol's list, a handwriting analysis on the loan document, grand jury. "And in the meantime," I said, "they file for guardianship in October." "Probably. And if a probate judge grants it before your case is ready, I lose control of everything, including my ability to hire Miss Cruz." Agent Whitcomb and Elena looked at each other. "Then we run them in parallel," Elena said. "Federal case on their track. My track is probate, and my track has one job: survive the hearing." So that is what the next 11 weeks became. 2 investigations moving at completely different speeds, and me, in the middle of them, still wearing the green cardigan, still not shaving on Wednesdays. I want to tell you about the second layer now, because this is where the story stopped being about my family and became something that still makes me angry at 3 in the morning. It started with the loan. Elena hired a forensic document examiner named Dr. Yusuf Brannigan, who had testified in over 400 cases across 9 states. We gave him 41 exemplars of Rosalind's genuine signature, spanning from 1979 to the summer before she died. Checks, greeting cards, her teaching contracts, the back of a photograph from our honeymoon. And we gave him the signature page from the $217,000 home equity line dated the 14th of September. His report came back on the 28th of August. 14 pages. I will summarize the conclusion, which he later said on the stand in almost the same words. The questioned signature was a simulation, a traced or freehand copy made by someone looking at a genuine model. He identified 11 specific indicators: pen lifts in unnatural places, tremor inconsistent with Rosalind's actual writing, and, most damning, a blunt start and blunt stop on the initial stroke, which is what happens when a person begins writing from a stationary pen rather than in motion. And then there was the R. Rosalind looped the descender on her capital R. She had done it since she was 14 years old, because a nun in Cleveland had taught her that way in 1962, and she never once broke the habit. The R on that document was closed. Whoever did this, Dr. Brannigan told us, was careful. They were also not looking at a signature from the last decade of her life. Their model is older, probably from the 1990s. That detail lodged in me. Somebody had gone looking for Rosalind's signature in old paperwork. Old paperwork stored in a house. My house. And then Agent Whitcomb's team pulled the notary log. The notary on the loan was a woman named Kendra Boyle, who at the time held a commission in Franklin County and worked, part-time, as a contract closer for title companies. Ohio requires notaries to keep a journal. Kendra Boyle's journal for that date had an entry for the Reyes transaction. It listed 2 signers, identified by driver's license. There was only one problem, and it was a problem no lawyer on earth could argue around. Rosalind's driver's license had expired 11 months before that date. She had let it lapse in the fall, when she stopped driving, because she stopped driving when the neuropathy in her hands made it unsafe. The license number in Kendra Boyle's journal was the number of an expired license, transcribed correctly, digit for digit. You do not transcribe an expired license correctly by accident. You transcribe it correctly when somebody hands you a photocopy. And the loan proceeds, all $217,000, had been disbursed by wire on the 19th of September to an account at a credit union in Hilliard. The account was titled Vane Holdings, LLC. Vane. Priscilla's maiden name. Marcus's name was nowhere on it, not as a member, not as a signer, not anywhere. Agent Whitcomb told me that on the 14th of September, exactly 3 years to the day after the forgery, and I remember I laughed out loud, which startled her. "Something funny, Mr. Reyes?" "No," I said. "It's just that I've spent 5 months hating my son for something he didn't do. Because here is what the forensic accounting eventually established, and what Marcus himself confirmed under oath. Marcus Reyes did not know about the home equity line on the Delaney Street building. His wife took $217,000 against his dying mother's property, forged her signature to do it, and never told him. And she did it 11 months before Meridian Senior Solutions was even registered as a business, which meant Priscilla Vane Reyes did not learn this from Wesley Thorne. She had already done it once, by herself, and gotten away clean. Meridian was not her introduction to this world. Meridian was her expansion. Now let me tell you about the other 13 names. Agent Whitcomb's team worked the list from the bottom up. I was not part of that investigation, and I did not ask to be. But because I was the reporting witness, and because Elena fought for it, I was eventually allowed to know the outcomes. Ruth Abernathy, 79, of Marbury. Her nephew was added as joint owner in November of the previous year. Her account was closed and cleaned out 3 months later. She died the following spring, believing her savings had been eaten by medical bills. Total loss, $286,000. Constance Mbeki, 81, a retired pharmacist. A guardianship petition was filed and granted in 7 weeks. She was moved into a facility called Sunrise Ridge, which billed her estate $9,000 a month. Her daughter in Baltimore was not notified of the hearing because the petition listed her as unable to be located. Her daughter had lived at the same address for 19 years. Harold Denning, 84. I want to slow down on Harold, because Harold is the one I still think about. Harold Denning was the first name on Marisol's list, a retired lineman for the electric company. Widower, $310,000 gone in 6 months, through a power of attorney signed by a daughter-in-law nobody in his family had liked. When Harold started asking questions, that same daughter-in-law petitioned for emergency guardianship and had him moved out of his house of 42 years. He died 14 months later in a facility in Zanesville, congestive heart failure. He was 85. His son, a man named Gerald Denning, who drove a truck out of Cambridge, Ohio, had spent 2 years telling anyone who would listen that his father had been robbed and had been told by 3 different people, including a police detective, that it was a family matter. A family matter. That phrase is why these people succeed. That phrase is the whole ball game. It is the door that gets closed on 10,000 Harold Dennings every single year in this country. And every person who closes it thinks they are being reasonable. Agent Whitcomb interviewed Gerald Denning in September. He drove 3 hours to Columbus to sit in a room and tell it one more time. She told me afterward that when she finished asking her questions, he asked her one. He asked, "Are you actually going to do something, or is this like the other times?" The total, when the forensic accountants finished, was $4,162,000 across 14 victims over 6 years. Wesley Thorne's cut, paid quarterly through what was booked as a consulting arrangement, came to $611,000. He had used it to buy a boat, a $9,000 watch, and a lake house in Knox County that he had put in his mother's name. Priscilla's take, through Meridian Senior Solutions, was $2,000,000 $340,000. And my son Marcus, who had betrayed his father, humiliated him, laughed in his kitchen, and helped construct a false record of dementia, had personally received $71,000. $71,000. He sold his father for the price of a mid-range pickup truck, and he was the only one of the three who had not gotten rich doing it. When Agent Whitcomb told me that number, I said, "That can't be right." She said, "It's right. He wasn't a partner, Mr. Reyes. He was a tool. They used him to get through your front door, and they paid him just enough to keep him from asking what the front door was worth." I sat with that for a long time, and somewhere in the middle of sitting with it, an idea started to form, a dangerous one. One that Elena Cruz argued against for 3 weeks. Because if Marcus was a tool and not a partner, if he genuinely did not know about the forged loan, about Harold Denning, about the 11 others, then there was one thing left in this world that could still turn him: his mother. The petition was filed on the 11th of October. I was served at 4:20 in the afternoon by a young man in a polo shirt who apologized twice. In the matter of the guardianship of Nathaniel A. Reyes, an alleged incompetent. An alleged incompetent. That is the actual legal phrase. They print it on the caption of the document, above your name, and you carry that piece of paper into your house and set it on your own kitchen table. The applicant was Marcus D. Reyes. The petition ran 9 pages. It said, I had left the stove on. It said, I had failed to pay bills. It said I had become disoriented in a bank lobby and could not complete a routine transaction. It attached Dr. Alan Pierce's 4-page report, and it said, on page 6, that the respondent has become socially isolated and has no consistent support network, having ceased contact with extended family and community. They had cut off my granddaughter in February, and in October, they used the silence they created as evidence against me. I read the whole thing twice, sitting at that table with the burn mark. Then I called Elena. They filed. I know. I got the notice an hour ago. Her voice was tight. Mr. Reyes, the hearing is set for the 16th of November. That's 5 weeks. Is that fast? It's very fast. That's Judge Pruitt's docket, and Judge Adeline Pruitt has a reputation for moving guardianships quickly. Is that bad for us? Elena paused. It's bad if we're wrong about her reputation. She moves them quickly because most of them are legitimate. She also has a documented history of denying petitions where she smells something. Twice in the last 4 years, she's referred applicants for criminal investigation from the bench. So it depends entirely on whether she smells it. Yes, Elena said. And Mr. Reyes, we cannot tell her. Not in a filing, not in advance. Agent Whitcomb's grand jury doesn't convene until January. If we put the federal investigation in a probate pleading in October, it becomes discoverable, and Thorne moves his money to a jurisdiction we'll never get it back from. So I walk into that courtroom, and I don't get to explain in advance. You walk into that courtroom, Elena said, and you let them make their case first, every word of it, and then you answer it. That was the plan. It was a terrible plan, and it was the only plan we had. The 5 weeks between the filing and the hearing were the worst of my life, including the 7 months when Rosalind was dying, and I do not say that lightly. Because the moment that petition was filed, the pressure came on in a way it never had before. On the 14th of October, Priscilla arrived with 2 men in a van and announced that they were going to move my bedroom furniture to the front of the house so I would not have to use the hallway. I stood in my own doorway and told them no. She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, in front of both men, Nathaniel, you understand, this is going to happen either way. On the 19th, my homeowner's insurance was canceled for non-payment. I had paid that premium by automatic draft for 11 years. The draft had been cancelled from the account Marcus now had authorization on, through a limited form Thorne had processed in August. On the 23rd, a woman I had never met knocked on my door and introduced herself as a care assessor. She had no identification and no appointment. I did not let her in. She wrote something on a clipboard on my porch and left. On the 26th, Marisol Vega was fired. Officially, it was for a policy violation regarding the handling of customer information. She had been at Harborline 6 years. She was walked out of the branch at 9:40 in the morning, in front of a lobby full of customers, carrying a cardboard box. She called me from her car, and she could barely speak. "I don't have November's rent," she said. "I have Diego. I don't have November's rent." Elena Cruz drove to her apartment that afternoon and filed a whistleblower retaliation claim within 72 hours. And I did something Elena told me not to do, and I would do it again. I withdrew $9,000 in cash from a small credit union account they did not know existed, and I gave it to her. "You cannot do this," Elena said. "If they find out, they'll say you paid a witness." "Then we document it," I said. "Every dollar, in the log, with the reason, and we hand it to Agent Whitcomb ourselves, before anyone asks. It's not a payment for testimony. It's a man keeping the lights on for a woman who got fired for telling the truth. I'll say that from the stand, and I'll say it in the exact same words." Elena looked at me for a long moment. "Say it exactly like that," she said finally, "and it might actually help us." Then, on the 2nd of November, 3 years to the day after my wife died, Sophie came to the house. I want to tell you about this carefully. It was a Thursday afternoon, and I saw her through the front window, standing at the end of my driveway in her school jacket with her cello case on her back, not moving. I went out on the porch. She saw me, and she didn't come any closer. "Grandpa," she said, "are you sick?" 16 years old, standing at the end of a driveway, asking a question she had clearly been carrying around for 8 months. And I had a decision to make, in about 2 seconds, and the honest answer would have been the safest one for me, and the most dangerous one for her. Because if I told Sophie the truth, she would confront her parents. And if she confronted her parents, they would know I was awake, and everything, the recordings, the grand jury, Marisol, Harold Denning's file, all of it, collapses. So I lied to my granddaughter. "I've been tired, sweetheart," I said. "That's all." She came up the walk then, and she hugged me, hard, the way she hadn't since she was small. And into my shoulder, she said something that I did not understand. For another 2 weeks, she said, "Mom said you didn't want me here anymore." I closed my eyes. "Sophie," I said, "look at me. Whatever happens over the next month, whatever you hear, whatever anybody says about me, you remember this. Every Sunday at 2 o'clock for 6 years, I made you a grilled cheese sandwich. Not one of those was an accident." She started crying. I got 22 minutes with her before her mother's car turned onto Chandler Street. 22 minutes. On the porch. 3 years to the day after Rosalind died. When Priscilla pulled up, Sophie stood up fast and wiped her face and said, very quietly, "She tracks my phone." 16 years old, and she already knew to say that. Priscilla did not get out of the car. She simply looked at me through the windshield for about 4 seconds, and then Sophie got in, and they drove away. That night I sat in the dark in Rosalind's chair for a long time, and I made the decision that Elena had been arguing against for 3 weeks. I called my son. "Marcus," I said, when he picked up. "Come by tomorrow, alone." There was a long silence. "Dad, I don't think that's..." "Alone, Marcus. Tomorrow at 4. Don't tell your wife." He came at 4:15, And he stood in my kitchen, with his hands in his pockets, and would not sit down, and I did not show him the recordings. I did not mention Wesley Thorne, or Agent Whitcomb, or the grand jury. I did not accuse him of a single thing. I put one piece of paper on the table. A photocopy of the signature page from the $217,000 home equity line, dated the 14th of September, 3 years earlier. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. He picked it up. He looked at it, and I watched my son's face while it happened. "This is the Delaney building," he said slowly. "It is. There's no loan on the Delaney building. There is. $217,000. Drawn 7 weeks before your mother died." He looked at the 2 signatures, and then his hand started to shake, and he said, "That's not Mom's writing." "No," I said. "It isn't. Dad, this is dated." He stopped. He did the arithmetic. I watched him do it. She was in the front room. She was on the patch. She couldn't hold a cup of water. That's right. Who did this? And I did the only thing I had left. I told him the truth, and then I got out of the way. "The money went to an account called Vane Holdings," I said. "Opened in Hilliard. Sole member. 1 signer." Marcus Reyes sat down in a kitchen chair, very slowly, like a man whose legs had stopped taking instructions. He sat there for a long time. Then he said, in a voice I had not heard since he was about 9 years old, "Dad, what have I done?" I did not answer that question, because there was no answer I could give that would have been both true and survivable. Instead, I said, "Marcus, I need you to go home tonight and act completely normal." He looked up at me, and his eyes were red, and something in his expression changed. "Normal?" he repeated. "Why would you say it like that?" And there it was. The moment I had been steering toward for 5 weeks, and dreading for 9 months. "Because you are going to be asked questions by people with badges," I said. "And what you say to them in the first 5 minutes is going to determine the next 10 years of your life." He went very still. "Dad, how long have you known?" "Since February the 10th, 2:40 in the morning. I watched 9 months land on my son all at once. The sticky notes, the cardigan, the gutter man, apple, church, table, the doctor's office," he said hoarsely. "The counting backwards. All of it? All of it. You let us—" He stopped and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "Dad, you let us take $100,000. 281,000, I said, as of last Tuesday. And my son made a sound I hope I never hear again. Here is the part that people find hardest to believe when I tell this story, and it is the part I am least able to explain. I did not forgive him that night. I want to be extremely clear about that, because I think we do enormous damage when we pretend that forgiveness is something you can produce on demand like a receipt. I did not forgive him. I have still not entirely forgiven him, 2 years later, and I have made a kind of peace with the possibility that I never will. But I did something else, and I did it because Rosalind would have skinned me alive if I hadn't. I picked up my phone, in front of him, and I called Elena Cruz, and I said, "My son needs a criminal defense attorney tonight. Not you. Somebody good, somebody independent, somebody who has never met me." He stared at me. "Why would you do that?" "Because your mother is dead," I said, "and I'm the only one left who can." Elena made 3 phone calls. By 11 that night, Marcus was sitting in the office of a defense lawyer named Ruth Okonjo, and he had told her everything. Agent Whitcomb had him in a room by Monday morning, with his lawyer beside him. He proffered. He gave them the timeline, the meetings, the invoices, the recruitment. He gave them the names of 2 other families Priscilla had discussed in his presence. And he gave them one thing nobody else could have. He testified that Priscilla had asked him, in the spring 3 years earlier, where his mother's old teaching contracts were stored. In a green accordion folder, in a cedar chest, in my basement, signature exemplars from the 1990s. Elena was furious with me for about 4 days. "You compromised the hearing," she said. "If Priscilla figures out Marcus has flipped before November 16th, she will withdraw the petition, liquidate everything, and we lose the courtroom entirely. She won't figure it out." "How do you know?" "Because she has spent 11 years being certain that my son is not capable of thinking without her," I said. "She's not going to start doubting that this month." I was right. But I want to be honest. I was guessing. I have never in my life gambled with a bigger stack. The 2 weeks before the hearing were an exercise in doing absolutely nothing, which is a much harder discipline than people understand. Elena filed no counterclaim. She filed no motion to dismiss. She filed a single-page notice of appearance as counsel for the respondent, and nothing else. That was deliberate. We wanted the record to show that the respondent's side did essentially no preparation. We wanted their confidence to be total. Meanwhile, in a windowless conference room in Columbus, Agent Della Whitcomb's team worked 11-hour days. They had the bank's internal CRM records under subpoena. They had 6 years of Meridian's bank statements. They had Kendra Boyle, who lawyered up on a Tuesday and started talking on a Thursday when she was shown the expired license number in her own journal. And they had one thing they had not had in 6 years of these cases, going unprosecuted in 3 counties. They had audio. On the 12th of November, 4 days before the hearing, Elena Cruz and I met with Agent Whitcomb one final time. "We're not going to be able to make the arrests in the courtroom," Whitcomb said. "That's not how this works. Warrants take—" "I know how it works," I said. "I'm not asking for a movie. Good. I'm asking for something smaller." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "This is what I need." She read it. Then she read it again. Then she looked at Elena. "Is this legal?" "Every line of it," Elena said. "He's a respondent, in an open probate matter. He's entitled to present evidence. He's entitled to have witnesses present. And nothing on that page requires you to do anything except be in a room. And the state banking regulators are entitled to attend a public hearing," Elena said, "as is a reporter from the Marbury Ledger, as is the son of Harold Denning." Agent Whitcomb sat back. And then, for the first time in 3 months of meetings, Della Whitcomb smiled. "Mr. Reyes," she said, "how long did you say you examined banks?" 41 years. It shows. The night before the hearing, I did 3 things. I ironed a shirt for the first time since February. White, heavy cotton and I stood in the kitchen with the radio on, and I smelled hot cotton in that house for the first time in 9 months, and I had to stop halfway through and put my hands on the ironing board. I shaved. And then I went around my house, and I took down all 12 sticky notes. I did it slowly. Stove, check before bed, lock back door, take blue pill with breakfast, and last, the one on the inside of the front door, at eye level, in that shaky handwriting I had practiced for 40 minutes in March. "Did you turn off the water?" I peeled it off, and I held it for a second. And then I put it in the fireproof safe with everything else, because it was evidence too. Then I sat down in Rosalind's chair in the dark. "Ross," I said, "tomorrow." And I thought about that old lion in the yellow grass, lying still with the herd walking past him at 40 yards. And I thought about what she always said. "Everybody in that field thinks he's finished." I slept 6.5 hours, which surprised me. The hearing was set for 9 in the morning on the 16th of November in courtroom 4B of the Marbury County Probate Court, before the Honorable Adeline Pruitt. I arrived at 8:31. I wore the ironed white shirt, a charcoal suit I had not put on since Rosalind's funeral, and my father's watch, and I did not put on the green cardigan. Courtroom 4B of the Marbury County Probate Court is not an impressive room. It seats about 60 people on wooden benches that were installed in 1971. The carpet is industrial blue. There is a water stain on the ceiling tile above the jury box, which is never used because probate matters in Ohio are decided by the judge alone. I want you to picture that room honestly, because this is where it happens. Not in a marble federal courthouse, in a plain municipal room with a water stain, in front of one tired judge with a docket of 19 cases that day. This is where 10,000 Harold Dennings a year get taken apart. Priscilla arrived at 8:44 in a navy dress and pearls. She had brought a cardigan draped over her arm, not for herself. For me, that detail told me everything about how confident she was. Wesley Thorne came in at 8:51, in the charcoal suit, with a leather folder, and sat in the second row like a man attending a colleague's retirement party. Dr. Alan Pierce arrived at 8:55, checked his watch, and sat near the aisle. Their attorney was a man named Brent Hallowell, who did about 40 guardianships a year and had the practiced, weary efficiency of someone processing paperwork rather than litigating a case. Marcus came in at 8:57 and sat at the applicant's table beside Hallowell, exactly where he was supposed to be, with his hands flat on the table and his face the color of paper. Priscilla leaned over and whispered something to him. He nodded, and behind all of them, filling in quietly along the back 2 rows over the course of 11 minutes, came the rest of the room. Agent Della Whitcomb and 2 colleagues, in plain suits, in the last row on the left. Nobody looked at them twice. 2 examiners from the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions, in the last row on the right. One of them, a woman named Priya Raghunathan, had been trained by me in 2014. Frank Delgado, in a brown jacket, 3rd row. Marisol Vega, with her hands in her lap, 4th row, beside a woman from Elena's office. Owen Brackett, of the Marbury Ledger, notebook out, aisle seat. And in the 2nd row, directly behind the applicant's table, a heavy-set man in his 50s, in a clean flannel shirt, who had driven 3 hours from Cambridge, Ohio, that morning. Gerald Denning, Harold's son. Nobody in the front of that room knew who any of them were. Not one. All rise. Judge Adeline Pruitt was 63 years old, with reading glasses on a chain, and the flat, unimpressed expression of a woman who has heard every single thing before. This is case number 23G914, in the matter of the guardianship of Nathaniel A. Reyes. Mr. Hallowell, you're the applicant. Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Cruz, you represent the respondent? I do, Your Honor. Mr. Reyes is present? And I stood up, in the ironed white shirt and my father's watch. I am, Your Honor. Good morning. Judge Pruitt looked at me for slightly longer than she needed to. Something registered behind those glasses. I have replayed that half-second 100 times. And then she moved on. Proceed, Mr. Hallowell. Their case took 51 minutes. And I am going to tell you the truth about what it felt like to sit through it. Because this is the part where people expect me to say I felt powerful. I did not feel powerful. I felt like I was attending my own funeral and being asked to listen to the eulogy. Hallowell called Dr. Alan Pierce first. Pierce sat in that box in a good suit and told a probate judge that in his professional opinion, based on a comprehensive evaluation, Nathaniel Reyes suffered from moderate cognitive impairment, likely progressive, and lacked the capacity to manage complex financial affairs. He used the phrase, "in my clinical judgment," 4 times. He did not mention that the evaluation had lasted 19 minutes. Then Hallowell called Priscilla, and my daughter-in-law was, I will grant her this, magnificent. She cried at the right moment. She talked about how hard it was to watch a strong man decline. She described finding the stove on. She described me repeating the same question about the trash collection 3 times in one conversation. She said, and I am quoting her from the transcript, "He forgets the name of the man who's cleaned his gutters for 15 years. Ray. He's known Ray forever." She had been building that anecdote since February, because I had handed it to her in February. And then Halliwell called Marcus. The room got very quiet, because everyone could see what was about to happen. A son testifying against his father. It is an ugly thing even when it is honest. Marcus was sworn. He sat down. His hands were shaking so badly he had to grip the rail. "Mr. Reyes," Halliwell said, "you're the applicant in this matter. Can you tell the court why you filed this petition?" And my son opened his mouth, and nothing came out. Halliwell waited. The judge waited. "Mr. Reyes?" "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "Could you repeat the question?" Priscilla turned her head at the applicant's table. Slowly. I watched her do it. I watched the first flicker of genuine uncertainty cross that woman's face in 11 years. Halliwell repeated the question, and Marcus said, "I filed it because I was told to." The room did not explode. That is not what happens. What happens is that a courtroom goes about 11 degrees colder, and everyone becomes very interested in their own hands. Halliwell said, quickly, "Let me rephrase." "Your Honor," Marcus said, and his voice cracked. "I'd like to speak to my attorney. Mr. Halliwell is your attorney." "No, ma'am," Marcus said. "My attorney's name is Ruth Okonjo, and she's sitting in the 3rd row." Ruth Okonjo stood up. Brent Halliwell turned around and looked at his own client's second lawyer, and I watched a man realize, in real time, that he had walked into something. Judge Pruitt took off her reading glasses. "Mr. Halliwell," she said, "are you aware that your client has separate criminal counsel?" "I was not, Your Honor." She put the glasses back on. "We'll take that up. Ms. Cruz, do you have witnesses?" And Elena Cruz stood. "Your Honor," she said, "the respondent calls himself." I walked to that witness box slowly. Not for effect. My knees are 71 years old, and the walk is genuinely 22 feet. I was sworn in. I sat down. I adjusted the microphone, which was slightly too low, and I said, "Good morning, Your Honor." "Good morning, Mr. Reyes." Elena Cruz stood at the podium with a single folder. "Mr. Reyes, would you state your full name and age for the record?" "Nathaniel Alonzo Reyes, 71 years old." "And your occupation before retirement?" "For 29 years, I was a field examiner for the Ohio Division of Financial Institutions. Before that, 12 years in internal audit at Fifth Central Bank in Columbus. 41 years total." Elena paused just slightly. "And what did that work involve?" "Examining the books and records of state-chartered financial institutions for regulatory compliance," I said, "including compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act and currency transaction reporting requirements." Behind Elena, in the 2nd row, Wesley Thorne sat forward about 2 inches. "Mr. Reyes," Elena said, "on the 11th of April of this year, you were seen by Dr. Alan Pierce. In his report, he concluded you were unable to independently manage complex financial affairs. Do you agree with that conclusion?" "No, ma'am." "Why not?" And I turned to Judge Adeline Pruitt, and I said, "Because I've been managing a federal financial crimes investigation from my kitchen table since February." The courtroom made a sound, not words, just a collective intake. Judge Pruitt did not move. "Mr. Reyes," she said carefully, "explain that." "Your Honor, on the 10th of February, at approximately 2:40 in the morning, I identified 6 cash withdrawals from my money market account, totaling $19,500, which I did not make. Each one was structured under the $10,000 currency transaction reporting threshold. Each was processed at the Fenwick Avenue branch of Harborline Community Bank, under a single teller override code. Halliwell was on his feet. Objection, Your Honor. Relevance. Overruled, Judge Pruitt said, without looking at him. Continue, Mr. Reyes. I retained counsel on the 13th of February. On advice of counsel, I made a decision, and I want the court to understand it clearly, because it explains everything else. I looked at the judge. I decided not to stop it. You decided not to stop the theft of your own money. Yes, Your Honor, because a stopped crime is a warning. A documented crime is a case. I let that sit for a second. Over the next 9 months, $281,000 was removed from my accounts. I recorded every dollar of it. And the impairment described by Dr. Pierce? Manufactured, Your Honor, by me. Dr. Alan Pierce, in the aisle seat, went the color of oatmeal. I stopped ironing my shirts, I said. I stopped shaving on Wednesdays. I put 12 sticky notes on the walls of my house. I asked my son what day the trash goes out, and I have taken the trash out on Tuesday night on Chandler Street for 38 years. Mr. Reyes, Halliwell tried again. Sit down, Mr. Halliwell, said Judge Pruitt. On the 8th of March, I continued, my daughter-in-law administered an informal cognitive screening in my kitchen, without my consent, and without any clinical credential. She asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I know the answer is 93, 86, 79, 72, 65, 58, 51, 44, 37, 30, 23, 16, 9, and 2. I said it at conversational speed, without stopping. I gave her a wrong count and a 9-second pause. She wrote it down. That report is attached to the petition currently in front of this court. Priscilla Vane Reyes had not moved in 90 seconds. Your Honor, Elena said, the respondent has 141 hours of recorded audio, obtained lawfully in a one-party consent state, all of which has been in the possession of the Federal Bureau of Investigation since the 3rd of August. I would ask the court's permission to play 4 minutes. Halliwell said, Your Honor, this is a guardianship hearing. Mr. Halliwell, Judge Pruitt said, your own client just testified that he filed this petition because he was told to. I am going to hear the 4 minutes. Elena pressed play, and the room sat in absolute silence, while a recording made in my kitchen on the 22nd of July filled courtroom 4B. You heard the kettle. You heard my finger moving on paper. And then you heard Wesley Thorne's voice, warm and clear and unmistakable, explaining to my daughter-in-law that guardianship is the only permanent instrument, that the respondent cannot retain counsel without the guardian's approval, and that he had been through this 11 times. Then you heard Priscilla ask, "What's your number on this one?" and Thorne answer, "Same as always, 15 off the top, quarterly, through the consulting line." And Priscilla, the invoices need to stop saying cognitive, say care coordination or family liaison. Cognitive gets flagged by the examiners. Elena stopped the recording. The only sound in that courtroom was Owen Brackett's pen. Judge Adeline Pruitt looked up over her reading glasses at the second row. "Which one of you is Wesley Thorne?" she asked. Nobody answered. "Sir," she said, "you are the gentleman in the charcoal suit who has been sitting in my courtroom for an hour and 11 minutes. Are you Wesley Thorne?" He stood up halfway. "Your Honor, I think I need an attorney. I think that's the most accurate statement anyone has made in this room today," said Judge Pruitt. Then she turned back to me. "Mr. Reyes, is there anything further?" And this was the moment, the only one I had actually rehearsed. "Yes, Your Honor. One document." Elena handed it up. Judge Pruitt read it. It took her about 40 seconds, and I watched her face change twice. "For the record," I said, "that is a home equity line of credit in the amount of $217,000, against a commercial property at 1120 Delaney Street, dated the 14th of September, 3 years ago. It bears 2 signatures, mine and my wife Rosalind's. And I never signed it, Your Honor. And Rosalind couldn't have. On the 14th of September, she was in hospice care in our front room, 8 weeks from death, on a fentanyl patch, sleeping 19 hours a day. She had lost the use of her right hand. I heard my own voice go rough, and I let it. She looped the descender on her capital R. A nun in Cleveland taught her that in 1962, and she never once broke the habit. The R on that document is closed. Judge Pruitt set the paper down very carefully. Who received those funds, Mr. Reyes? An entity called Vane Holdings, LLC, I said. Sole member and sole signer, Priscilla Vane Reyes. And in the second row behind the applicant's table, Gerald Denning, a truck driver from Cambridge, Ohio, who had spent 2 years being told his father's case was a family matter, put his face in his hands and started to cry. Your Honor, Elena Cruz said quietly, the respondent moves to dismiss the petition, and I'd note for the record that there are 3 federal agents and 2 state banking examiners seated in the back of this courtroom, and they did not come here for me. Judge Adeline Pruitt took off her reading glasses and set them on the bench. The petition is denied, she said. With prejudice, the court finds the respondent fully competent, and I will say for the record that Mr. Reyes has demonstrated a level of executive function this morning that exceeds that of most attorneys who appear before me. She looked out over that room. Bailiff, no one leaves this courtroom, and somebody get me the number for the county prosecutor. Nobody was arrested in that courtroom. I want to be honest about that, because the version people expect involves handcuffs at 9:40 in the morning, and that is not how the world actually works. What happened was quieter, and, in the long run, far worse for them. Agent Della Whitcomb walked up the aisle and introduced herself to Wesley Thorne and told him that agents were at that moment executing a search warrant at the Fenwick Avenue branch and at his residence in Knox County. Priya Raghunathan and her colleague from the Division of Financial Institutions walked out of that courtroom and drove straight to Harbor Line's corporate office in Delaware, Ohio. And Dr. Alan Pierce tried to leave through the side door and was politely stopped by a bailiff and asked to wait. The arrests came 6 weeks later, on the 9th of January, after the grand jury returned a 41-count indictment. Let me give you the numbers, because I promised you specifics, and because numbers are the only language these people ever actually understood. Wesley Thorne, convicted at trial on 19 counts, including conspiracy to commit bank fraud, wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and money laundering. He turned down 2 plea offers because a man who has gotten away with something for 6 years genuinely cannot imagine a room where it stops working. Sentenced to 19 years in federal prison, ordered to pay $4,162,000 in restitution, jointly and severally. His lake house in Knox County, the boat, and the $9,000 watch were all forfeited. His mother, who had known nothing, lost a house she thought was hers. Priscilla Vane Reyes pled guilty to 11 counts, including wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, forgery of a financial instrument, and conspiracy. The forged signature on my wife's loan was charged separately by the state, and it carried its own weight, and it was the count her attorney could do nothing with. Sentenced to 14 years. Ordered to forfeit $2,340,000. Meridian Senior Solutions was dissolved. Vane Holdings, LLC, was seized. Dr. Alan Pierce pled guilty to conspiracy to commit healthcare fraud and making false statements. Sentenced to 6 years. His license to practice medicine in the state of Ohio was permanently revoked in March. and the medical board's written opinion used the phrase, "a fundamental betrayal of the physician's role," 3 separate times. Kendra Boyle, the notary, cooperated early, testified at Thorne's trial, and was sentenced to 3 years and stripped of her commission for life. And my son, Marcus Reyes, pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. He cooperated fully. He testified for 2 days at Wesley Thorne's trial, and he did not soften a single thing, including the parts that made him look exactly as bad as he was. Ruth Okonjo argued for probation. The government did not oppose a downward departure. Judge Marlene Opperly sentenced him to 8 years. I was in the courtroom that day. I had written a letter to the court, and it was 3 paragraphs long, and I had rewritten it 14 times. The last paragraph said this: "My son is guilty of what he has admitted to." I am not asking this court to pretend otherwise. I am asking the court to note that he is the only person in this case who chose, on his own, before he was caught, to tell the truth. That decision cost him everything he had left. Whatever that is worth, I would ask it be counted. 8 years. He will serve about 6.5. I visit him every second Saturday. It is a 2-hour drive each way. We do not talk about the case. We talk about Sophie and baseball, and whether the Delaney Street Bakery has changed its sourdough recipe, which it has, and which we both agree was a mistake. Some Saturdays are all right, some are not. I have stopped expecting a particular kind of Saturday. Now, the money. Harborline Community Bank settled with all 14 victims and their estates for $6,200,000 without admitting liability, after the state banking department opened a supervisory examination that I am told was extremely thorough. Priya Raghunathan ran it. I was not involved and I did not ask a single question about it. But I have seen her work, and I will say only that I trained her. My personal recovery, between restitution, forfeiture, and the settlement, came to $2,318,000. That included the full $281,000 taken during the 9 months, the $217,000 from the forged home equity line, and the encumbrance on the Delaney Street building was voided entirely. The other 13 victims and their families recovered $3,940,000. Gerald Denning's share, on behalf of his father's estate, was $310,000. He called me the day the check cleared. He did not say thank you. He said, "They told me it was a family matter." Then he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Mr. Reyes, my dad was a lineman for 38 years. He climbed poles in ice storms. He wasn't a family matter." "No, sir," I said. "He wasn't." Marisol Vega settled her retaliation claim for $145,000. She did not go back to Harborline. 8 months after the hearing, she was hired as a Bank Secrecy Act compliance analyst at a credit union in Dublin, Ohio, at a salary of $68,000, and she finished her bachelor's degree the following spring. I wrote her recommendation letter. It was 2 pages long, and the first line said, "In 41 years of examining financial institutions, I met exactly 1 employee who kept a private log of things she knew were wrong when nobody was making her do it. Her son Diego is 11 now. He calls me Mr. Nate. He is a terrible chess player, and he refuses to accept this." 18 months after that morning in courtroom 4B, on a Saturday in May, I stood in a high school hallway in Marbury, Ohio, holding a pair of scissors that were far too small for the ribbon they had given me. Let me back up and tell you how I got there. When the criminal case ended, I had $2,318,000 sitting in accounts, and I was 72 years old, and I did not need it. I have a paid-off house, a state pension of $4,100 a month, and a commercial building on Delaney Street that brings in $38,400 a year. My monthly expenses, honestly counted, are about $2,900. Money that sits still is money that has decided to stop meaning anything. I learned that examining institutions, an asset that produces nothing, is just a number wearing a costume. So I sat down at that kitchen table with the burn mark in the corner. And I did what I have always done. I made a ledger. $600,000 went to Marbury High School. Rosalind Reyes taught orchestra in that building for 31 years. She did it in a converted storage room off the east hallway, with no soundproofing, one working radiator, and a cabinet of instruments, so old that she personally repaired the same 3 cellos for 2 decades. She asked the district for a proper rehearsal space 4 times. In 1994, in 2001, in 2009, and in 2016, she was told no 4 times, always politely, always because of the budget. The last time she asked, she came home and made dinner and did not mention it, and I only found out because I saw the letter in the recycling. The Rosalind Reyes Memorial Music Wing opened on the 4th of May. 2 rehearsal halls, acoustic treatment, 41 new instruments, and a practice room with a window, because she used to say that no child should have to learn beauty in a room with no window. There is a brass plate by the door. It does not say anything about me. It says, "For Rosalind Reyes, who taught here for 31 years, and who could tune a room by ear." 400,000 more went into an endowment, the Rosalind Reyes Music Scholarship, which pays $4,000 a year to 2 graduating students who intend to continue studying music, chosen without regard to grades or income. Her old department chair asked me what the selection criteria should be. I said, pick the 2 who would keep playing anyway. And I put $250,000 into a trust for Sophie's education, which she cannot touch until she is 21, and which is administered by Elena Cruz. The rest is invested, boringly, the way I have invested for 40 years. And when I die, it goes 3 ways: to Sophie, to the scholarship, and to a legal aid fund in Franklin County that represents elderly respondents in guardianship proceedings who cannot afford counsel. Because here is the thing that still keeps me up at night, and I want to say it plainly. I won because I had $2 million, a lawyer, 41 years of technical expertise, and a bank teller with a conscience. Harold Denning had none of those things. He had a truck driver's son who kept telling the truth to people who had already decided not to listen. The difference between me and Harold Denning is not character, it is resources. I will not insult that man's memory by pretending otherwise. So the dedication. Sophie played at it. She is 18 now. She lives with me on Chandler Street, and has since the January after the hearing, when the court granted me custody, and she brought 2 suitcases and a cello into the room my son grew up in. That has not been simple. I want to be honest about that too. Her mother is in a federal facility in Kentucky. Her father is in one, in Pennsylvania. Sophie has spent 2 years carrying something no 18-year-old should have to carry, and there have been nights she has screamed at me in that kitchen, and there have been nights she has come and sat on the arm of Rosalind's chair and said nothing for 40 minutes. Both of those are progress. I have learned to count them both. She is going to the Oberlin Conservatory in the fall. She got in on her own. I found out because she left the acceptance letter on the kitchen table with a sticky note on it, a yellow one. She used one of my old ones from the package of 300. It said, "Guess the notes worked." At the dedication, she played the 2nd movement of the Elgar Cello Concerto in a room named after her grandmother, in front of about 140 people, in a building where that grandmother had spent 31 years teaching in a converted storage closet. She played it well. She played it better than well. And halfway through, I looked up at that brass plate by the door And I thought about a Wednesday in March when I stood at my kitchen sink with my hands in warm water and let a woman walk through my dead wife's bedroom, cataloging me for a court filing. I thought about the 9 seconds I sat silent before I said 72. I thought about the 12 sticky notes and the green cardigan and my son's short, nervous laugh at my own kitchen table, and I did not feel triumphant. I want to be truthful with you about that, because I think a lot of stories lie about this part. I felt tired, and I felt grateful, and I felt something that took me a long time to name. I felt like myself again. So here is what I would tell you, if you have made it this far with me. If someone in your life has started explaining you to other people, your health, your memory, your judgment, in a voice they use when you are standing right there, pay attention. That is not concern. Concern speaks to you. Management speaks about you. If a family member suddenly wants to be added to an account, or wants a power of attorney drafted by a lawyer you have never met, or arrives with a doctor's appointment already scheduled, do not sign anything that day. Not one thing. You are allowed to say, I need a week. You are allowed to say, I'll have my own attorney look at it. A person acting in good faith will wait a week. A person who cannot wait a week is telling you exactly who they are. Keep your paper. Every statement, every year. It is boring, and it is your armor. And if you are the one who sees something, a teller, a nurse, a neighbor, a mail carrier, understand that you may be the only person in that human being's life who is in a position to notice. Marisol Vega whispered 9 words across a marble counter, and it dismantled a 6-year criminal enterprise. 9 words. She did not have power. She had attention, and she had the nerve to use it. There is one more thing. Do not mistake quiet for finished. The world has a habit of looking at a man in a worn flannel shirt, driving a 9-year-old Buick, and deciding that the story is over, that the decades are behind him, that whatever he used to be, he is now simply an item on someone else's balance sheet. That assumption is the most expensive mistake 3 intelligent people ever made in my presence. Rosalind's old lion was not weak, lying there in the yellow grass while the herd walked past at 40 yards. He was patient. There is a universe of difference between those two things, and the only creatures who cannot tell them apart are the ones walking too close. I spent 41 years reading other people's books, and I only ever needed one rule, and it never failed me once. Every ledger balances eventually. You just have to be old enough, and quiet enough, and stubborn enough to still be sitting there when the numbers come due. Mine came due on a Thursday morning in November, in a room with a water stain on the ceiling, and they balanced. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments, especially if you have ever been the one everybody underestimated. Give it a like so it reaches somebody who needs it today, and subscribe to Old Lion Stories, because there is always another one coming. And if you would like to support the channel directly, there is a thanks button under this video. It is never an obligation. Just knowing you sat with this story to the end is enough, and the quiet ones are never as finished as they look.